Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts. Today we welcome back television producer, director, and writer Tom Phillips, who's joined by Dr. Hogan Sherrow, an evolutionary anthropologist trained at Yale, to dig deeper into the psychological research behind the Salem Aftermath script. And this is our second look at the project. The first was an introduction to the story itself. This time we go into the real people who filled those pages. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
This is Sarah Jack. Starting with the question Tom poses, the one that has followed the Salem witch trials for more than 300 years, and the one so many of us have wanted answered. Why did Ann Putnam Jr. do what she did? A 12-year-old girl became a central accuser in the deadliest witch hunt in American history, and later, she was the only one known to publicly apologize.
So let's look straight at Ann Putnam Jr. with Tom and Hogan, who examine Ann not as a villain or a symbol, but as a human being, using a method Hogan calls evolutionary behavioral reconstruction. It draws on life history, cultural context, and the pressures bearing down on one child in an extraordinary household.
My ninth great-grandmother, Rebecca Nurse, was among the women Ann accused. Aftermath refuses the easy sorting of that history into saints and monsters, giving Rebecca and the Putnams alike their full humanity.
During today's episode, we'll be sharing world premiere test footage from Aftermath, Tom's production that brings Ann's story and the people around her to life. So stay with us.
Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts. Welcome back, Tom Phillips. And we're so happy to have you here today, Dr. Hogan Sherrow. Please each tell us about your background and how we're here today talking about the Salem witch trials.
Let me start because it leads into Hogan. So I had to write a story about a historic figure that we had a lot of information but no answers. So I had worked with Hogan for 2 shows for the History Channel back in 2009, 2010. Not even sure. And what I found about Hogan, he's going to love this, he reads people like we read books. He's very observant and able to put pieces together. So when faced with having historic pieces and no answers, I needed to go to him to hope that he could shed some light on a question that's been over 330 years old. Why did Ann Putnam do what she did? What was her motivation? And from there, Dr. Sherrow, please take it away.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, good to join you guys this morning from surprisingly clear skies, Oregon, considering the wildfires we've been dealing with. So my name's Hogan Sherrow. I've got a PhD in evolutionary anthropology from Yale University. I started out studying the behavioral ecology of wild chimpanzees and used those data combined with human data to do reconstructions on our hominin ancestors, so our closest ancestors and more distant ones. And as Tom said, we worked together on a couple of shows, got to know each other well. And when he reached out to me, I thought, oh, this is a really cool opportunity to take a pretty notorious figure and do some behavioral reconstruction using a technique that I've been developing called evolutionary behavioral reconstruction, where I combine multiple different disciplines and data for multiple different disciplines together to try and come up with essentially a profile of an individual. And it's always fun working with Tom. Tom, I appreciate that I read people like most people read books. I don't know if that's accurate. And a lot of times it seems like I'm reading comic books instead of books, but.
Let me also add, so no one has talked about this in public before. This is the first time we are opening up about what we've done. This project has been going on for 3 years. I'm working with 3 of the leading authorities on Salem, Professor Benjamin Ray from University of Virginia, Tad Emerson from Salem University, and Marilyn Roach. All of these are published authors, brilliant people, and without their research, this wouldn't be happening. So let's get into it.
And Tom, you're also in conjunction with this working on a project called Salem Aftermath. What can you tell us about that?
That is originally as a TV project or a feature film. We're going to take it to the stage first, the next October. This October is too soon. We have a beautiful theater all lined up. We have to cast it, and we didn't want to rush into it. And I think the concept of bringing out these characters on stage live is going to be better than the big screen. especially Anne, being the amazing person that she is. And we should probably tell people who she is. So Ann Putnam, the center of our story, is the main accuser in the trials. And how important is she? A lot of historians feel if you took her and her parents out of the equation, it never would have happened. So she's the core, her and her mother and her father.
And so you've written a screenplay, you've planned a script, so you want to get the story out so that we can meet Anne.
Yes, and in your case, Sarah, I'm sure everyone knows you're a descendant of Rebecca Nurse, and the Nurse family and the Putnam family were like the Hatfields and the McCoys. They were at each other's throats. So for you, I think you'll find this very interesting because I'm sure you're wondering why Anne did what she did to your ancestor. I mean, it's brutal, but we think we know why.
That's awesome. I want to know a little bit more about this behavioral science lens because we very often are on the show talking about the cultural context and these community and family stressors. So it's these outside pressures and influences. And today we get to look from the inside and at the human. Tell us about your behavioral science and how it can be used.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So, first, it does not discount any of the cultural influences. Cultural influences are massive in the everyday human experience. Those I like to think of it as a layer. So, that's a layer that goes on top of a framework that's built into all humans, the human typical behaviors that we see cross culturally, and those behaviors get triggered by the ecological context that you're in. So your social context that you're in, your cultural context that you're in, the environment that you're in. And so we see different behaviors and different strategies by individuals and groups based on that context. But they're always within a realm of possibility. Right? We don't suddenly start building nests 80 feet up in a tree and giving birth to our kids 80 feet up in a tree because things got crazy on the ground. We do things within the realm of human behavior. And so that's where the predictability comes in, is by taking in those factors, putting them all, like another metaphor I like to use is like throwing them all in the hopper, right? You mix them all up and you figure out what makes sense together. Or another image I've used for people in the past is it's a complex, almost four-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
And how is behavioral science used in criminal investigations?
So in criminal investigations, you typically see maybe a forensic psychiatrist or a psychologist be involved. And some of these techniques that I use and some of the methods that I use are very similar. And most of psychology in general is coming up with these kind of typical behaviors that you expect. And then you highlight the aberrant behaviors, right? The outliers are the things that obviously will stick out to you. So when you see something like a serial killer and you're asking, why would this person do this? You start looking at what are the outliers in their lives? What are the pressures, Sarah, that you mentioned, right? Some of the family pressures or cultural pressures that they experienced. And this is evolutionary behavioral reconstruction is using a lot of those same techniques, but bringing in things like our evolved psychology. So we all have a human brain, and that brain is the result of selective pressures. And so we have those kind of typical aspects of the brain, and again, those limits that the human brain can function in.
And I'd like to point out myself working on Salem since 2007. I was with History Channel doing Monster Quest back then, researching my first witch show, which went to Nat Geo. What I find interesting, I'm equally guilty because all the historians, everyone knew what Ann Putnam did. But for some reason, she never got focused on. It was always overlooked. And I think the reason being, historians are afraid to sensationalize her like Hollywood would do because they only want to be factual. They don't want to speculate. Even their personal opinion, they will hold back on. So we had all these pieces, but what Anne did at 12 years old just bothered me. So I didn't understand. I'm thinking, well, what's wrong with this picture? Now, Puritans are always pictured as hysterical. They use the word witch hysteria. But if you look up Puritans, their character, they came in a wooden boat across the Atlantic Ocean. Back then, I wouldn't be doing that. Come to a war-torn country. France and England were at war. Native American types were common. So what do? Do they run? They turn their homes into forts. So when they attack, they retreat into their home. These don't sound like cowards at all. And they're highly educated, writing, reading, masters of the English language, and they founded Harvard College, which became Harvard University, one of the most respected institutions in the world. So I think people have to get out of that mindset and realize these people are not easily fooled. They're not easily swayed. They're not stupid. And as Margot Burns said in a phone call a while back, brilliant woman, expert on Salem, Puritans do not make mistakes. So how did a 12-year-old girl pull this off? And maybe we should go into what she did.
Yeah, so we're going to use this profile to look at someone who lived centuries ago. I'm excited to do that. And one of the things that you just mentioned, Dr. Sherrow, was the limitations. And I've been thinking lately about the limitations on this community, but also these high expectations. Is that part of it? But go ahead and get us started on how can we profile her? How do we look at her?
Yeah, so when Tom reached out to me, I didn't know much more than the kind of, typical education level in high school of like, yeah, Salem witch trials happened. They were terrible. So I got into it a little bit and I asked Tom a lot of questions, and the folks that he mentioned before gave us a lot of information, relied on the historical data a lot. And that's the starting point. Is Tom mentioned everybody knows what she did. And okay, let's start there. And let's start to look at what are the kind of like typical or non-fantastical things that could lead to that sort of situation. The first big question for me is, and Tom mentioned it, how does a 12-year-old have this kind of sway? I think in addition to what Tom said about people downplaying that, I think the fact that she was 12 when this all started made a lot of people discount her importance in it, because it was, from our perspective, like you think of a 12-year-old and you think, I'm hoping that they can find matching socks, like you're not thinking they're going to sway an entire community. And that may be changing with TikTok influencers these days. I don't know, whatever that term means. But we think of them, they're kids. And so I think automatically there's a bias that comes in. So that's part of it, is let's look at those biases, because I will be the first to tell you that there's always bias in everything we do. And I'm a scientist, yes, and I reach for objectivity, but I also know that I have bias in everything that I do. And so let's look at those biases. So we get into that and we start let's pull those out and say, okay, let's try and get at the raw data. And so looking at her age is really important, because it means that she's really impressionable. She's at an age where her body is starting to change hormonally. Her growth is slowing down. It's not stopping yet, but it's slowing down. She's starting to mature, but also that means that there's a potential for instability. There's a potential for people to put ideas into heads. And so that's where I started, was her life history part. And then getting into what is, and Sarah, this goes to your point earlier, what's the cultural context that she's growing up in? And Tom just laid out the basics of Puritan culture. And one thing that he didn't mention, but Puritans also were pretty strict on their children. Children weren't outspoken. They would not have been TikTok influencers. They spoke when spoken to. And so the fact that you have this outspoken 12-year-old that then got traction kind of lights that fire, of that investigative fire of why. And again, so now we start getting into those elements more.
Now, if we look at what she did, this is interesting. I've been looking at this for over 15 years. She saw things. She heard things. She felt people touching her, being pinched. 3 things. Now, what does that? Obviously, it sounds like a mental disorder. And psychosis is one of the things that we talk about with Hogan. If you look up psychosis, if I'm correct, Hogan, those things all fit into that mental illness, correct?
They do, yeah. There are lots of things that potentially fit, just that can fall into that. But definitely that was something to consider is, do you have an individual that potentially had what today would be diagnosed as a mental disorder or mental condition, who then could be manipulated and exploited into, or even if it was an intentional manipulation or exploitation, just the interpretation. I remember, Tom, one of the first things that we talked about was the devil was real for these folks. The devil was in their lives. And any aberrant behavior can get explained that way. And it has real power within the society because it is a very real presence to them.
Now, to give a little bit of history so everyone knows, Ann's not the first one to act oddly. It starts in the minister's home. His daughter and her cousin were the first ones to show behavioral issues. Now, this is interesting too. Kids always have a network of communication. Like there's no internet, there's no TV. But before this happened in the 1600s, there was a similar case in Connecticut. If you go back to England, the Pendle witches, even earlier, involved children. So the question is, could these children have heard about this in colonial America? And one issue that came up, Paris kept a record of these things, witchcraft, in his library. So kids with no TV, no radio, sneak into the dad's books, go through and read them. So they might have heard or known about what these kids did, which would give them an example of what to copy. So these two girls start. Dr. Graves gets called in. He's an elderly man. He wants to protect his position. And he says, well, I don't know what it is, but instead of saying I don't know what it is, it's got to be witchcraft. That's the first time the word witchcraft is used in Salem. This is January 1692. So Dr. Griggs starts it. Now, Anne, let's just say Anne had psychosis. I know it's a little bit young, because and Hogan's the expert. She's 12 years old. Now, say you had hallucinations that were starting, and her mom also had hallucinations. So she's growing up in a house with her mom has a similar problem, which is probably where she inherited it from, just posing a theory. So now you hear about these two girls who are your friends, and the word witchcraft comes up. Now, you don't know what's wrong with you, but now you have an answer. You go, aha, that's what's wrong with me. I'm bewitched. I'm possessed. But she, in her case, being possibly mentally ill, doesn't know about mental illness. And like Hogan said, if you can't answer it from a medical point of view, it's got to be the devil. So now she thinks she's bewitched. So that means somebody had to bewitch her. She's defending herself and her family.
We know Ann Putnam Jr. said she had these visions and felt these different things. What if she was lying? Is that a possibility here?
Absolutely. So I always start from, I have inherently a skeptical mind. So
I never noticed
that. Every time someone says anything, my first thought is, well, what if they're not necessarily, what if they're not lying, which is definitely a possibility in her case, but what if they're just mistaken? You know, what if she had a bad nightmare, but she was sure she was awake?
Yeah.
And she was hearing voices.
Yeah.
I mean, if you have kids, you know that they wake up from some dreams where they're pretty positive stuff happened. And so there are all sorts of possibilities. And Josh, I think that's an important point, is that we don't know, because we didn't have a nanny cam sitting in a teddy bear watching the situation. We don't know for sure the context in which this happened and the details. And context is everything. And so trying to get to where we can reconstruct that context. Tom brought up maybe these kids read about this. Well, it may not even be a matter of them reading about the stories. It may be that that's a boogeyman that gets used. It may be that in a culture where the devil is real, you use the boogeyman of if you're not a good kid and if you don't eat your vegetables and listen to your parents and everything else, then you will end up, the devil will come for you and you'll end up possessed. And from my own work, when I used to teach at a university, I would talk about that's where a lot of your like mythological creatures, and Tom, getting back to our Monster Quest days, that's where a lot of those stories come from. Is if you think about it, you're in a context, say you're living in a forest somewhere, and if your kids step off the trail, they have a high likelihood of being bitten by something poisonous or stung by something. And so you're trying to keep your kids alive. What do? You tell them, hey, if you wander off, the people from the forest will come and take you and eat you, or they'll come and take you and you'll never see mom and dad again. I used to use it with my girls all the time in reference to cars. I didn't want them crossing the street without me. I'd say, by the way, that's a 6,000-pound animal that will take you away from me forever, when they were really little. And so it's something that humans use with our symbolic communication capabilities. And all it would have to be is a scary bedtime story to keep your kids, and they start thinking about what could we do to really, I don't know, man, I've got kids. What could they do to piss off mom and dad, right? What could we do to get more attention? What could we do to get back at this person? And they very much could, to your question, Josh. Absolutely, that's a possibility we have to consider, right? Tom laid out a hypothesis there that Anne may have had a mental disorder of some kind. Josh, you just threw out another possibility. Anne may have been lying the whole time.
If I could add, I looked in Puritan faith. Lying was you go straight to hell.
Sure.
Puritans, if you lied, that was not something they encouraged, and that's something she was brought up strictly with. So the chance she was lying.
Hold on, I'm going to push back a little bit. We need to leave the possibility open because there are all sorts of rules that our society goes by and kids break them all the time. So again, thinking of her life history, and I'm not saying that she didn't have a mental disorder. I'm not saying that she was lying or wasn't lying. I'm saying that those are all factors that when I'm doing the behavioral reconstruction, I have to take into account. And then you start crossing off possibilities based on the preponderance of evidence.
I really like this point of the boogeyman because we do look over at the Goodwin children in Boston. Their afflictions were just a few years before, but it stayed in one household. And then you come over here to Salem and you've got Betty Paris and Abigail Williams in the pastor's household. But then suddenly Ann Putnam and Susanna Sheldon, they're not in the same household and it's happening. And I kind of thought more of this story that was circulating, but I hadn't really thought about the threat. What if it's not just Samuel Paris at the pulpit saying the devil's here? What if the parents are saying the devil, we don't want the devil in our home, So that was interesting.
And that, Sarah, that's a really good point about Puritan life that we need to consider, because when I say the devil was real to these people, these folks weren't like most people who are churchgoers in America today who go about their daily lives doing data entry or whatever job they have, and then on Sunday morning go and listen to a preacher's sermon, and then it's gone Sunday afternoon because there's a 1:00 football game on, and they move on with their lives. The Bible was their main reading source. Bible study was a part of life. It wasn't like, and we also get together for an hour on Wednesday and barbecue and talk about what was said in Leviticus 12:18 or something. It was part of their lives every day. And so that's a part of that. As you said, it's not just coming from the pastor. It's not just coming from the preacher on Sunday. It's every day in their lives. And that's an important contextual part. But I think getting back to Tom's point, if you have a mom who has recorded behavioral abnormalities, I'll say that, right? We don't know that it was a mental disorder, but is acting in a way that is not typical. And then a daughter that is as well. you have a high probability mental disorders are genetically related, but it's hard to tease that out because, as Tom said, if you're growing up in that household where the model behavior that you have of a grown-up woman and you're a little girl is she hears voices, she speaks, she has these experiences, that's going to imprint on that child no matter what. So even if she didn't have an inherited mental disorder, she was adopting behaviors that were modeled for her by the main adult in her life. And then the step I would take further is if the parents have, and this is getting into that social contention and resources, which is a big part of what I study, is resource allocation and fights over resources. If the parents have a lot of contentious issues with other people within the society, and you want to get what they have or take care of that situation, and you have this child who's recognized as acting out, now you've got a situation where it's easy for that child to be, and I won't say used as a puppet, but it's easy for that child's behavior to benefit those people.
In the record, Ann Sr. does blame Rebecca's specter for killing her nieces. Nieces and nephews are her sister's children. That these ghosts of her dead nieces and nephews come and say it was Rebecca. Rebecca killed us. So that there was this loss in the family that they were trying to reconcile. And I think Ann Jr. was the oldest child. Her mother was struggling, as she appears to have been, for all the reasons that she would be. There was a lot of pressure on Ann, I'm sure of it.
And I want to point out, Ann Sr. did lose a baby, a 6-week-old Sarah, just before the affliction started.
Okay.
So there was a fresh wound, and obviously Ann Jr. was upset about it because she's commenting about them attacking this sister of hers.
Yeah, and I think everything you guys just mentioned are they're really important variables to consider when you're thinking about what would have led to that behavior. And that, again, that's been my role in this project, is what would lead to that behavior. And Josh, what you just pointed out, which I didn't actually know that, thank you for pointing that out, is the losing the baby, 6-week-old baby. It's going to be even more traumatic than a baby that doesn't make it to term or to birth, because you're hopeful. And psychological triggers are real things. And so a psychological trigger like that could have easily pushed mom over the edge, which then results in Ann acting out. And if you had mental instability, a propensity for mental illness, those kind of factors, and that's what we're talking about when we're talking about this kind of behavioral reconstruction, is taking those into account to look at why would people act the way they are. And all of those are really excellent variables to help explain the behavior.
Now, if we can go back to Anne, so after the first occurrence, once she gets into the pack, they all follow her lead. She actually is the center accuser. The other girls follow her. She's actually the ringleader. So is it possible if this girl was a natural born leader, and say if she had been born any other time or place, she would have had a normal life and used it for constructive purposes, but she just had a strong, overwhelming personality without having a mental disorder that people automatically were drawn to her very words? Is that possible, Hogan?
Sure, it's possible. It's hard to tease out because of what we know happened. It's hard to tease out whether she would have not had some sort of potential mental disorder or not have acted in this kind of way. But she definitely was charismatic. And I think that's obvious just by the fact that, again, a 12-year-old in this society acts out in this way gets focused on, and then, as you said, Tom, others kind of followed. So
Right.
whether it was just with her peers or not, she definitely was charismatic. And, charisma can be used for good or for ill, and it gets used that way all the time. We see it in cults around the world. Cult leaders have incredible charisma. There's no way to deny it. They're not somebody you want to follow, but people do follow them. And so I think it's one of the things that I think is important to remember is that these things aren't like just because someone's charismatic doesn't mean that they're going to do something either good or bad. And yeah, Tom, I mean, we talked about it briefly. I think if Anne had been born in a different time and in a different context, Sarah, getting back to your original point that you made when we first started this conversation, she would have had a completely different trajectory, and she would have been probably lived a completely different life. And if it had been more close to the 21st century, she probably would have been diagnosed. If she had a mental disorder, she probably would have gotten the help that she needed. If she didn't have a mental disorder, she probably would have been in a situation where mom and dad hadn't lost as many kids, and so she wouldn't have had those stressors. I won't say that there still wouldn't have been accusations of witchcraft, especially since they're still going on today. But definitely she would have had a different experience and potentially been a completely different figure. And who knows, we may not have even known her name if she had been born 100 years or 300 years later.
One example of her ability to control a room is with Sarah's ancestor, Rebecca Nurse trial. We should go into that. So Rebecca Nurse is found innocent. She is highly regarded in town, highly respected. She's found innocent in court. The magistrates, all grown men, Puritans, not stupid, say you're innocent. And immediately goes into one of her shows. Now, we don't know exactly what she did. There are descriptions distorting her body, speaking oddly, but she terrified the room to the fact they go back and they come back and say, oh, no, she's guilty. Now, how does a 12-year-old take a courtroom over? They come to a conclusion. It's kind of embarrassing for them. Think of it. They're going to admit they're wrong. What did she do? What could have happened that changed the minds of the court?
Right?
That's just mind-boggling. I'm just
Are you
mind-boggling.
asking
12 years
me?
old. Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, God's not here, so you're on.
I think a lot of things. Josh brought up, could she have been lying the whole time? And while I think the probability is probably pretty low that a 12-year-old holds that bit that long and doesn't have some cracks in it. However, you think of young actresses who turn in great performances. There are very gifted performers, so we can't rule that out, right? But I think the impact on the men. I mean, Tom, I asked you this the first time we talked when you were like, "Hey, so we really want to get into how these women got accused of witchcraft and how the society." And I said, which of the men who are making the call or making the accusations, who were they sleeping with? Like, what were they trying to cover up? What were they? What was kind of the seedy underbelly of the society? And you say, well, how could these men go back into a room, deliberate, and come out? Let's say that originally one of them wanted to convict for whatever his own reasons were. He got overruled by the other group of men. Then there's this acting out, and he says, we need to reconsider. And he uses that. See, there's proof. The devil's in the room and acting out through this child. I brought up the child factor, and I think that's a really important thing to remember because initially we look at how could this child be listened to by an entire society. Also, let's flip it. If you're part of that society, your assumption is the child is innocent. The child is not manipulative. So if a child is acting out, If a child is contorting their body and speaking in strange tongues and doing these violent shakes and everything else, that you're, again, bias. Your bias is that child is an innocent actor and isn't trying to manipulate people. And so when you ask Tom that question of how could these men be convinced, it fits the narrative in their brain. The child's not trying to manipulate us. That child is acting out because there's a demon involved right there. And you said it, Tom. That's where you go to, right? If you don't have that explanation, you don't have any other explanation. So in answering how could they be manipulated, but it gets back to your point originally that Anne obviously was really convincing. With everything she did, she was obviously very convincing. But I do want to, again, context is important because she was very convincing, but it fit right into the narrative. And that may have been the genius that, if she had a genius, that may have been her genius, is being able to play into the existing narrative that already works.
Now here's the thought. So let's look at the three gatekeepers here. The big question is, why did anybody stop her? So how would they benefit? So if you're Anne's parents, you have your social standing, your land disputes with the nurse family. Now your daughter is fighting a devil. She's the hero of the town. You move up the social ladder. You have no reason to stop her. She's doing what the church says is right. And the magistrates, oh, we're saving the town. She's empowering their position. They're loving it because now we're going to be the heroes. And the church, if you don't have a devil, who needs a minister? So everyone's benefiting for this, except for her. And I'm trying to make the point that she may have been the only unselfish one in those four groups. She might have been doing what she was doing. She thought it was the right thing to do. She didn't benefit from it. In fact, it would ruin her life. But the other three parties all benefit from her actions. So why would they stop her?
Yeah, I agree. Once it got going, it benefited the right people in the right situation. But I would also say we don't know if it benefited her in the short term or not. Because she might have gotten extra special attention. She might have gotten, like you said, Tom, she's fighting the devil, right? So while long term, her life may have suffered from it. In the short term, and we think about this every day, most humans only act on what's the short term benefit. I mean, I won't jump too high on my soapbox, but it's why we're in the environmental situation we're in right now. Right? Yeah. People say, "Well, what's going to benefit me?" And so we need to, again, when we're doing this kind of reconstruction, we're looking at why would she do that? I mean, seriously, if mom and dad are giving you an extra pat on the back, most kids will do lots of things. And we all see it in the reverse, right? If a kid is lying and their parents don't want them to, and Tom, you brought up about the Puritans and lying and that sort of thing, it got reinforced by negative reinforcement, by punishment, by them, maybe verbally abusing their kid, threatening their kid with "you're going to go to hell." Like, you can reverse that and say, and when the kid does the right thing, "Oh, here's an extra sugar cookie. Oh, you're such a great kid. Oh, you get extra attention from mom and dad." And we know from primate studies from my previous world that just physical touch. In fact, there's a brand new article out this week talking about physical touch and friendly touch in primates and how we see it in the other apes. Now, anyone who's studied primates, anyone who read the old Harlow studies from the 50s knows when the rhesus macaque baby completely ignored food to hold on to a terry cloth doll because it was isolated and just wanted physical touch. So I say all that to say that for children, any kind of reinforcement like that can multiply that behavior. And here Tom is getting to why the other girls would get involved. Because if they see Anne benefiting in the short term, they jump on the bandwagon.
Right. Now, the other piece I want to remind is that Anne died at 36 years old. The life expectancy is 70 years in Salem. I think Boston is actually 50. Oh, I could be wrong, but 70 years. So she dies young. Her mom dies young. Another possible evidence that they both suffered, because schizophrenia also and psychosis can lead to an early death. Correct, Hogan?
Well, that can be a side effect. That basically because people don't take care of themselves, they don't get taken care of properly.
Especially back then.
Doesn't physically lead to death. It leads to them mentally not taking care of themselves. Yeah, and Puritan communities had really high life expectancy relative to every place else at that time, basically. And so, the fact that they both died young is an indication of something going on. And there's a part of evolutionary studies called life history theory where you're looking at resource allocation and strategies based on how fast someone's life pace is, and they take into account things like stressors and things like that. And when you combine that with things like coalition formation in humans, in-group, out-group looks, things like that, all those are areas that I study and things that you bring in. A lot of Anne's behaviors start to make some sense in that, there was a high stress situation. Lifespan may not have been that expected to be that long. And I don't know anything about Ann Putnam Sr.'s mother. It'd be really interesting to know if dying early was a kind of commonality in that family.
I thought her mom lived longer. I think she lived a normal life. And the reason why I remember it is that schizophrenia can skip a generation and show up again. Am I correct, Hogan?
There's some indication that can happen, but we don't even know if there's a direct genetic link between parents and children. We know that there's some sort of genetic influence. There are predispositions, but there's no way to say for sure that this is going to happen. But even if grandma lived to 104 years old, but you're seeing your siblings, Sarah, as you pointed out, and the oldest child, you're seeing your siblings dying at an early age. Death is all around, and it can happen at any time. And so that psychologically speeds up the things that you do. And so you end up doing things like taking riskier strategies. And it may be that the Putnams took riskier strategies to get to what they wanted. And Anne may have been part of that. She may have done that on her own. And I will always leave the door open that there could have been, to Tom's original hypothesis around this, there could have been mental illness that kind of catapulted her into that. And if let's theorize for a minute and say she had a mental disorder and she gets positive reinforcement from her parents for that mental disorder because it's having, and from the society because it's having the impact that they want it to have. Exactly. There's no reason for anyone to stop what she's doing. There's no reason to look at it beyond this poor child is afflicted. There's a devil that we need to. Now, what I find interesting is that in other societies, you would see direct action being taken on that individual that's possessed. We need to get the demon out of them. We need to exercise. We need to do all these sort of things. And we don't have that kind of, from my knowledge, there isn't that record of, instead it's pointing the finger at who, because Tom, before we started recording, you held up your little voodoo doll, right? And that's an important part of the history that I think people talked about the Puritans or Christian, but you got to talk about the other influences where people can actively put a hex on other people. And that's something that we don't have in today's society. Again, folks who are Christian don't think of someone in church getting mad at you, pointing their finger at you, and going home and doing a ritual, and you get possessed by the devil. We think of it as if someone thinks that there's demon possession, that's a supernatural thing that doesn't have a connection to another person. But in human societies around the world and in early Christian beliefs, that was still held on to of, and Sarah, that's where your ancestor got the raw end of the deal, is that you get mad at someone, you can point out. I mean, and I just want to give some further context. I worked in East Africa for decades, and still occasionally take folks over. 2 years ago, I led a safari over there, and so do some wildlife trips over there and some cultural trips. And while I was there in the field, I learned about a woman who was killed in town because she was accused of witchcraft. And it was eerily similar to the witch hunt stories that you hear, that Sarah and Josh, I know you guys are neck deep in all the time. But it was this woman who was accused by people in the town because she had had a dispute with them. And in this particular case, the person was killed by a mob. Um, and so I say that not to say anything about like African culture. We have witch hunts going on in this country right now. Um, and
Yep,
and
correct.
so part of the reason I bring that up is because we need to realize that this is also part of human behavior, is when you're part of a coalition or a group and you're against another individual or group, one of the ways that you can get advantage over them is to accuse them of behavior that scares everyone else. And that's what it boils down to, is it scared people because the devil was real in their world, and because of social hysteria, those individuals then can become scapegoats and become the way that someone gets what they want out of the society, resources, whatever the case is, power, whatever the situation.
I wanted to point out that the Goodwin children in 1688, one of their motivations seems to clearly have been getting out of chores, because there's a lot of commentary about how they couldn't do chores and they couldn't listen to Bible instruction or anything like that. And then Ann Putnam Jr. had another influence in the household, which was their maid, 19-year-old Mercy Lewis, who also was afflicted and testified a lot in court. If Anne had a mental illness, like what types of conditions are we talking about? I know Tom's mentioned psychosis, but what is in the realm of possibilities for her?
Well,
Oh,
yeah, I'm not a psychologist and I'm not a psychiatrist, so I'm not going to go too far into specific potential diagnoses. But I also want to bring up another factor. It may not have been mental illness at all. She could have had epilepsy. We don't know. So I bring that up simply to say that, again, we can't say for sure. But if she did, absolutely, she could have had a psychosis of some kind. She also could have been bipolar. She could have had chronic depression. People don't think of that with children, but it happens. You could literally probably open up a psychological textbook and go through her symptoms that she displayed and say, there are a lot of these that could apply. And so that's part of the reason why I'm very hesitant to use a specific illness, because without, a psychologist or psychiatrist, a trained mental health worker watching her, you're never going to be able to even get close to that diagnosis. But I do want to make the point that, Tom's idea that she could have suffered from a mental illness is absolutely, given what the historical record says about her behavior, is absolutely one of the potential possibilities here. And I don't think is far fetched to think about at all. And again, going back to the life history components, that reconstruction, just briefly, again, think about this as a child who, in that incredibly stressful environment, is getting to an age where hormones are starting to flow at levels that they have not before. Not saying that she was, getting into menstruation or anything like that, but she's getting to a time where hormones are starting to flow like never before. The expectations on her are changing, her body's changing. All of that, if you had even a propensity for a mental illness, or a mental illness that was kind of there but not really being expressed, we see it today. And a lot of teens, when a lot of those things get expressed. So, yeah.
For Hogan, this is key. So he made a point that these kids have no outlet for their energy, youthful energy. They can't dance. Singing is limited. There's no internet. They really have a terrible life for children. But one question that comes to mind, we all know that parents think their kids aren't doing anything. Every society, kids aren't, but they're out smoking, having sex, drinking. So back in Puritan society, is there any chance teenagers would have had any way to get together? Would they have found a way? I mean, they should do a show on sex in Salem. I think it would be an interesting topic. But what? But why do we have Hogan here? I mean, humans find a way. Because why it bothers me. Anne obviously never got married. Did she ever even hug him? Could you even sneak a hug behind a tree? Could you get a kiss? I mean, were they totally void of being able to show passion as normal teenagers do? What do you think, Hogan? Is that possible to shut the human body down?
No.
Or do you think they found a way to get together?
I'll give you the answer that you know all too well from our Monster Quest days. No. So, quick story, you guys. Second time Tom and I worked together, we were in Florida and we were doing a show, and I got asked a question by my partner in the show. And I said, no. And the director said, cut. Hogan, can you say anything more? And I was like, no. The question was a yes or no answer, and the answer is no. Like, there's no possibility of what he just asked. And the director's like, yeah, but we've got a 45-minute show. We need to fill it. Can we? And Tom was the one who came over, and he was like, hey, man, I get it. You're giving the straight answer, but could you conjecture a little? Could you maybe if this or, and then that? So, Tom, yeah, the answer is no. You're not going to shut down teens from being teens to a certain degree.
Okay.
They're going to feel, but here's an important follow-up part. They're going to feel intense guilt because of the societal pressure, which means that things are going to get hidden even more, which means that if you have somebody sneaking off into the woods or sneaking off into the hay barn or whatever the case is, they're going to work even harder to hide it. And so that, again, puts that pressure on them. And it means that if you need to act out in weird ways to distract them from the fact that you were messing around with somebody else, then you're going to do that.
Now, last question for Hogan. Anne is now an outcast. 5 years later, I won't get into the story that the play will get into. Now, marriages are set up by families, or you could have someone contact the father, I want to marry your daughter. That's how they usually worked out. But do you think Anne, being an outcast, men would have avoided her, young men would have stayed away from her because of her reputation, because her family didn't want her name associated with them? How do you think that would have worked out for her? Would anyone have even considered her as a girlfriend, as a friend, even a friend?
It's hard to say. I know a lot of people who like alternative personalities in their lives in the modern world, but not outwardly. Outwardly, people would almost certainly shun her, men and women. Any man who might have shown interest is going to get pressure, especially from the women in his life, from mothers, from sisters, from cousins of that woman's that woman's bad news. She probably, essentially had a scarlet letter in that regard. That doesn't mean that Anne did not have relations with men or women, for all I know. That doesn't mean that that things weren't happening. They just weren't happening on the surface. And almost certainly she wouldn't have had any kind of like potential value as a wife in that time period, especially given her mother's reputation than her reputation coming out of that situation.
That's sad. That's a sad thing. Sarah, you want to comment? You're the woman in the group. I mean, she had no love life, no family,
Yeah.
never have her own children. What is that like for a woman to face that you're done at the age of 17? I
Yeah.
mean,
As Dr. Sherrow has said, we cannot know. And all of these are possibilities. I do look at the communities, and there were other witchcraft accusers getting married. Witchcraft accusations didn't always turn into these hunts, especially the Salem witch trials. The aftermath of Anne is just what we know. And it's so tragic. And I want to, if we have a moment, let's just speak about her apology and what evidence that piece is, because that's one tangible thing, one of the only voice of an afflicted girl that we know of as an adult. What can we take from that?
Let me, Tom, really quickly, let me just say to Sarah's points there. She's an outcast in that society. She's got, like you said, Sarah, the status is pretty much gone. She probably doesn't have a lot of opportunity to bring in resources, much less have time or energy for a man. I mean, we take up a lot of time and energy. We're a pain, you know.
speak for yourself.
I am. I tell my partner Nikki every day she's incredibly patient.
So let's look at the confession. So, Hogan, I don't know if you have a copy of it from 1706, 12 years later, after the trials. There's two interesting lines here. Now, this was written supposedly by Reverend Green, who we believe was an above average intelligent man because he actually went to Salem, it was torn apart, and actually got the town together after the other ministers failed. So he supposedly wrote this, but she had input. There's two lines. So the first to draw your attention to, I then being in my childhood. Now, I sent this to a former New York City district attorney, and she, I can't mention her name, she's pretty high up. And she was saying, well, that right there is saying, I'm not responsible, you are.
Mm-hmm.
And then she goes on to say, I was made the instrument for the accusations. Okay. Deluded by Satan, delusion of Satan. If you look up the word deluded, again, she's not really taking blame. She's passing the blame on. Now, Hogan, what's your take on that? I don't know. Can you read this? Do you have it up?
Yeah, I read through it. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's a sorry not sorry, to use a common colloquial term for
Yeah.
today. It's a wasn't my fault. And I mean, we hear that in our society a lot these days, where people don't want to take accountability for things. In this particular case, it may be accurate. I mean, that's always something that we need to consider. You have a 12-year-old that was making these accusations. It may be accurate. You may have had a kid who had some sort of, again, potential mental disorder or a condition that made them especially vulnerable. And I mean, we always need. I'm not absolving anyone. I'm not. But we always need to take into account that she could have, in some ways, been a pawn in a much larger game.
And I just want to point out, when I read that as a descendant of Rebecca Nurse, it's truly Anne Sr. that infuriates me, because the scene she painted of Rebecca's attack is just so vicious. It was a vicious spun story, but also she's painting Rebecca as vicious. And then when I look at what Ann Jr. here wrote, I feel like it does acknowledge that there was suffering. And I think that she can acknowledge that because she herself has suffered. That is snuck in there.
Now, one thing we didn't mention, which a lot of people may not realize, and Hogan, I may not have told you this. So let's just say Anne was normal. after the first accusation. The parents took the children to the executions. It was like going to the ball game. She would have been front row and center when that body dropped. Now, when that body dropped, the neck didn't break. Hands tied behind the back. They would kick on that rope. I think, 7 to 8 minutes a human can stay alive? They slowly suffocate. She saw this. She saw it not just once, over and over. Now, wouldn't that, if the kid was normal before that, wouldn't that leave the kid with some issues? I mean, I can't imagine watching a human die at 12 years old, even if I hated them. When you see the act of violence, when you see it, isn't that going to affect their mind?
I would say this: if it doesn't affect their mind, then we know they have a mental disorder.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. That's
If it
horrific. I
doesn't
can't
affect
believe
their
they did
mind,
that.
that means that they're a sociopath or a psychopath. And yeah, I mean, but public hangings were common until the late 1800s, and in some cases, early 1900s in parts of the U.S. And children were often allowed to be there. I agree with you. It's horrific. I think it's horrific to have a public hanging at all and people showing up, like you said, Tom, like it's a ball game and waiting for their Cracker Jacks or something. But yeah, it should have. Again, if it didn't, then I think we can say case closed. There was a mental disorder.
And wouldn't you agree that, say she really didn't realize the merit of her actions, but seeing the body hang, that moment in her life, she knew she was partly responsible
Sure.
for it,
Yeah, absolutely.
right?
Which would have racked somebody with guilt for the rest of her short life, most likely.
Right,
And
right. Especially later on when you
yeah,
realize,
and
what
Sarah, I
happened.
really appreciate your perspective on that, of how you view that and the way you pulled that out of there, of her acknowledging their suffering, because she did suffer afterward. And I think there was that shared, and Tom, getting to your point, but that kind of, oh shit, what did I do kind of element of that. And it comes across in that apology. I agree. I think it does come across to some extent.
Now, the handwriting analysis, I don't know if we have time to go into that, but I looked at all the signatures that I could find on the internet. Her father, I sent some to Josh and Sarah. They all spell their first name with a capital letter. Ann spells her first name with a small letter. And I think, Hogan, you looked at that and you thought the last name didn't match the first name on that signature that you saw?
If you look at the two of them, they're written in a completely different way, and they're completely different sizes on the image that I saw,
Yes, I agree.
which I think could indicate. And again, I'm not a handwriting analyst or anything like that, but to me indicates that the first name could have easily been written a little bit under duress. It could have been that, I mean, we know that the Puritans overall were very well educated.
Yes. Yeah,
Yep, but
exactly.
let me finish. But we don't know how well educated Anne was in regard to how literate she was. Do we have other examples of her handwriting? Do we have anything to compare it to? Do we have any
She was
other
old.
examples of, do we have a journal from Ann Putnam? Do we have anything like that? Without that, we can't say for sure that Ann Putnam signed it. We can say that
Yeah.
the historical record tells us that Ann Putnam signed it. We can't say that Ann Putnam wrote it. The last name to me looks very similar to the rest of the apology letter. The first name is much bigger letters. It just looks like they may not have been put down at the same time. And again, it could have been, I'm going to go out on a limb here because it's not my field at all. And the handwriting experts can jump in and say whatever they want. But to me, it looks like that name may have been kind of forced to be written down.
Now, I filmed that myself at the Essex Danvers. So that was the actual document. And what
Sure.
I find interesting, but I was not only directing, I'm focusing the camera, and I never noticed it. I'm like, okay, fits the frame. Next shot, I'm
Yeah.
out. 15 years later, I'm like, I said to my historian, why did anyone notice this? It just strikes me as odd.
And I think the Anne starting out with the lowercase letter, Tom, we talked about this a little bit. I mean, that could indicate a lot of things. That could, as you said, Tom, it could indicate I'm different than everybody else. It also could indicate an individual who's feeling very small It also could
Humble.
indicate an
That's
individual who's feeling humble, who's feeling very diminutive relative to everything else. I mean, it
which
almost,
is tragic.
to me, only looking at it a couple of times, it almost looks like a little kid wrote Anne and then an adult wrote Putnam. The way it's written.
And we know from looking at other documents that the men who were documenting the history, they would add in, they would leave things out, come back, and they were mixing things in together. There's a lot that needs
They
to
were like
that,
podcast producers. They
yeah.
would
Yeah.
mix it in properly.
They just mix
Exactly.
everything in.
Her father definitely did that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Josh, you
Okay.
know what I'm talking about. We've been looking at these documents this year and seeing.
We've seen some things like warrants where the first names were left blank and then another person with different handwriting came in and filled in the first name later because the judge who was doing the warrant didn't know the person as anybody other than Goodwife so-and-so. They didn't know the women's first names because
Have you ever seen a first name spelled in that time period with a small letter?
I personally can't say that I have.
I haven't, but I'm not. You guys probably read more because of what you're doing to get the legislation through. I've only looked at 9 of them, I think.
Hmm.
That's why I found it odd, but
Yeah.
maybe I'm
No,
wrong.
it
I don't know.
definitely sticks out. It sticks out. Yeah.
Yeah.
What do we need to remember as we look at the Salem witch trials based on all the things that we've considered today?
I think what I hope I did with Hogan and Ben, Marilyn, and Tad, we call Tad, is his nickname, Emerson, Professor Emerson, that one thing we did do, we humanized Anne. We didn't demonize her, as all the characters, as Samuel Nurse. They are human beings trying to survive. And keep in mind, Anne, when she does the apology, if she doesn't do the apology, she doesn't join the church, she can't go to heaven. So she's fighting for her internal peace. So she's a human being. We don't know exactly what was wrong with her, but I think she should be treated as a human being, as your ancestor, and as a woman who did not get to have a woman's life. She was robbed. You only live once. She didn't get anything. For what she did, pretty much ruined her life. So I'd like to let the world know who she was.
I think that's part of the reason why Tom and I have worked together as long as we have and will continue to work together is that at the core of it, we understand that human behaviors in itself is really interesting, and you don't need to have a supernatural component necessarily for it to be interesting. And you don't need a villain in a situation for a horrible situation to happen. In society, you can have situations spiral out of control without a particular villain to point to. And so for me, that's why I was interested in this project and why I stay interested in it is let's actually look at them as human beings and consider them as human beings and consider everyone. At the end of the road, people may end up deciding that, oh no, that person was not a good person, or that person was a person in a terrible situation. That mystery to be solved is part of what keeps me doing this kind of work.
So after talking to Hogan, God, 2 years ago, Hogan, I and Marilyn Roach, an amazing lady, she's the woman in the group. And I think I even talked to Sarah. Sarah actually made an interesting comment on creating dialogue for Anne. The first thing we wrote that she would have said. So we asked her a simple question: what happened? And then I would work with Marilyn and get, if my direction was lost, I would go back to Hogan. And I think actually I talked to Sarah. Sarah, you made an interesting point. Why she never married and why she never had a relationship with a man, because you had said because men had let her down. And I never thought of that, a woman's point of view. So with the dialogue, Marilyn helped write this, obviously, and I ran it by AI, but keep in mind that so many information I have, there's a document from Benjamin Ray, has not been published on Anne's apology, which I have, and 2 books. Marilyn Roach has a book. Emerson Baker has a book that haven't come out yet. So we have information that AI doesn't have. But AI was pretty on top of what I wrote. But if you want to play that clip, This test footage is not really a promo into what Ann might have been like. She would be 17 years old in this clip.
Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again about a vision softly creeping. I hear them. I hear their whispers. Oh, many dead. Did I kill them? Was I deluded? Possessed? I was but a child. Did Satan truly guide my hand? Am I truly to blame? Has God forsaken me? Have I done the unnameable? Now I be an outcast. No man will speak to me nor look my way. I will never be embraced, never to be loved, never to bear children. Soon it be night. The darkness comes for me. There be no dreams now, only nightmares. And the screams, I still hear them. There be no peace for me. Some may say I be innocent. Some say I am guilty. Then there are others who say I am evil.
Our thanks to Tom Phillips and Dr. Hogan Sherrow for taking us inside a story most people think they already know, and for reminding us that a terrible situation does not require a villain to become terrible.
Salem has been told on screen and on stage many times, but almost always with Ann as a villain. Aftermath is the rare telling that puts a real complicated human at the center, and that is why it deserves an audience.
Help us get Aftermath in front of more people. Share this episode, tell somebody about the project, and follow along at aboutwitchhunts.com. Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.